So I like to start in talking about immigration by giving a little bit of historical context. This is a chart that shows you, if you follow the gray line, the immigrant share of the total population in the country over a long period of time, from 1850 until today. And what you'll see is, if you grew up, as my grandmother did, for example, around 1910, 1920, it would have seemed very normal to you that the immigrant population made up about 14, 15% of the total population. That was what it was like for the prior decades, and up and down a little bit. And that would have seemed like just the kind of status quo for the country. You follow the chart after that, you see obviously a precipitous decline in the number of, in the immigrant share of the population. World War II, the Great Depression, there was restrictionist policies on the federal level. For a lot of reasons, immigration pretty much got shut off in the 1920s and 30s. So if you grew up, as I did, in the 1960s and 70s, what would it seem like the normal population share would be 5 or 6%. And I think a lot of people today are kind of riding that, that line, if you could say it that way, and realize that what they grew up with was about was very different than what we're seeing today. Today we're back to about 13.5%, so very close to the level that it was a century ago. If you look at what happened to the total population, so that's the green bars on the chart, you see the total population grew pretty steadily throughout that time. And that's been important to the country's growth, to the economic growth, to the overall position of the United States in the world. A lot of what happened was, as the immigrant share declined, you saw the baby boom after World War II replacing immigrants. So while there's a little bit of a slowdown in 1930 and 1940, you then see this big rebound, and that's picked up again by immigration later. So that's kind of the long story. Of course, people talk about undocumented immigration. It's been an important and controversial point. And I would just add this about that. So when we talk about immigrants at the Fiscal Policy Institute, and in general in the academic literature, when we're talking about immigrants, people will try to separate out undocumented immigrants where it's possible to do that. But we're talking about immigrants overall, both documented and undocumented. I think people often have the impression that undocumented immigration has been growing out of control. And that's not really the story. It was growing steadily from 1990 through about 2007, when it sort of stopped growing at the same time again as the economy turned, although also the Obama administration stepped up enforcement. For that combination of reasons, the economy and increased enforcement, you saw the undocumented share, the number of undocumented immigrants actually went down by about 1 million, and then pretty much has leveled out since then. So where we are today is we do have about 11 million undocumented immigrants. It's a big issue, but it's not a growing population. It's about the level that it's been for quite a while. Immigration to America is also much more diverse than I think many people realize. Sure, it's true that about half of the immigrant population is Hispanic, 45%, but more than a quarter are Asian, 18% are white, and 8% are Black. So you have a pretty diverse population, people coming from all around the world. And in fact, I would say one of the interesting stories is within each of these American categories of Hispanic, Asian, white, and Black is also a tremendous amount of diversity, much more than was true 40 or 50 years ago. So Asians coming from all across Asia, Hispanics and Latinos coming from all across Latin America and the wider parts of the world, and similarly in Africa and the Caribbean. Eastern Europe as well. Immigrants are a very big part of America's economy today. In fact, if you remember, so the immigrant share of the population is 13%. The immigrant share of gross domestic product, so the overall economic output, is actually 16%. So it's an outsized share. They're contributing more than their share of the population. How can that be? That surprises people often. Let's say there are 3 reasons. One is that immigrants come as young adults, right? They're more likely to be in the working age population and therefore more likely to be in the labor force. Second is, I think people underappreciate how diverse the range of occupations, the kinds of jobs people do really is. So if the immigrant share of the labor force is 17%, the line across the middle of your chart, you can see that, as you might expect, as I think people often recognize, in farming and construction toward the right-hand side, you see pretty significant shares of immigrants, more than their share of the labor force. You know, they're overrepresented there. But immigrants are also overrepresented among computer and mathematical careers, in architecture and engineering, physical sciences, and healthcare support, and also, I think, maybe more intuitive but less often obvious to people, that in food preparation and building services and maintenance and personal care. And if you don't just look at the orange bars, but look across all of the brown bars as well, there's really no place where immigrants are not playing an important role. 17% may be their share. You know, they would, all these bars would be at 17% if immigrants were exactly equally distributed across the labor market. But you know, they're in a number of cases also playing an important role, even if they're a little below 17%. And then immigrants are entrepreneurial, and this is something I think is easy for people to understand. So immigrants, here you see these same numbers, 13% of the population and 17% of the labor force. Immigrants also make up 18% of business owners and 28% of what we call Main Street business owners. So by Main Street business owners, we mean grocery stores, people who have restaurants, retail shops, beauty salons, dry cleaners, the kinds of places that give a neighborhood its vitality and that often are key to revitalization of cities around the country. I just back up for a second to say, you know, this overall immigration story in America plays out in very different ways in different parts of the country. Here's a map that shows you the density of immigrants by county. And so the darkest are where immigrants make up 30% or more of the population. And the lightest are where immigrants are less than 5% of the population. And I would just note that you can see here, if you know the economic picture, a lot of where you see immigrant concentration is also where there's economic growth. And that's not a surprise to economists, but I think people often under-recognize that that's what's going on, is immigrants are going places where there's economic growth, and also when they go there, they're creating and fueling further economic growth. And let me just dig in a little bit further around the question of declining population cities. So a lot of what people, a big story of the mid 20th century, from 1960 to 1980, was cities seeing population decline. It was white flight from the cities. There was continued suburbanization. A big part of it actually was the decline in immigrants coming. Here are the cities that had population decline. There are 29 of them. 29 of the 50 largest cities saw this population decline. Some of them very significant, 40% of the population lost in St. Louis, 34% in Cleveland. So of these 29 declining population cities, 14 of them rebounded with an increase in population 1980 to 2013. Or actually, I think we can even say it's 2016 now. So here are the cities that saw an increase in the immigrant population. New York obviously really stands out. Of course, it's partly because it's a big city, but it's also because it came from a very low point in 1980 after the 70s, where I think younger people I know today that I talk with don't remember and don't recognize that New York was really nearly bankrupt and in pretty terrible straits in the 1970s. But also Portland, Oregon, Seattle, San Francisco, Denver, this whole range of cities that saw population rebound. So here are the cities that rebounded without an increase in immigrant population. Okay, that's not a mistake. There are none. The only cities that rebounded from the mid-20th century population loss did it with a net increase in the immigrant population. And I always like to stress, this doesn't prove that immigrants cause growth. It may also be that immigrants are drawn to growth. But if your city's plan is to grow without immigrants, it's good to keep in mind that there are 0 examples of that happening over the last 40 years.